In only a matter of weeks, the latest Formula 1 game from Codemasters will be released, and it will be the first one under the new naming convention, as this year's title is simply named F1 22. That small change in the naming of this year's F1 game is one which falls into line with the branding of EA's other sports games, as F1 22 is the first F1 game from Codemasters to have been developed entirely whilst under EA's ownership. Ever since EA bought Codemasters for $1.2 billion last year, there has been a lot of concern from the community about how it could impact the F1 games. We've seen a couple of effects of the takeover, and the F1 Live feature in this year's game is the source of a lot of people's skepticism. But just how valid is that given what we know so far about F1 22? We've been able to get a hands-on look at a preview build of F1 22, which contains a genericized and obviously not final version of this year's F1 cars, 5 of the circuits including Miami, and only the Grand Prix and time trial game modes. New features for this year's game include immersive and broadcast options for the formation laps, safety cars and pit stops. The immersive options will give players more control over what happens, so immersive pit stops feature the need to time when to turn into your pit box, something done with a single button press, and how well you time that affects your stationary time in your pit box. Immersive formation laps will require players to park up in their starting grid slot, giving them the freedom to angle their car in a particular direction to help cover off another driver off the start. The broadcast options will take control away from the player and instead show some TV style graphics, including, as an example, expected race tyre strategies on the formation lap. Along a similar line, the voice talent has been expanded for this year's game, featuring Channel 4's Alex Jakes as a selectable commentator instead of David Croft, Sky Sports presenter Natalie Pinkham as a co-commentator, and former F1 drivers Jacques Villeneuve and Jean-Eric Vergne have lent their voices for the French language option. Miami will be included in the game from launch, along with the updated layouts for Australia, Spain and Abu Dhabi, although none of those 3 circuits were in the preview build. Other touted changes which we haven't been able to experience due to us not being able to try out career mode yet include a new AR heat map, practice program, different starting budget levels for my team, more consequential department events which can have long-term impacts, and finally, that you'll be able to train your pit crew and improve their performance. The most talked about change is F1 Life, which we've yet to try out or even see much of yet, but what we do know is that it will act as a multiplayer hub area but presented as your driver's apartment. The best racing game comparison to draw on would be the Test Drive Unlimited series. And we do know that F1 Life will allow players to earn clothes for their character and furnishings to decorate your apartment with. Part of what your driver's apartment will show off are supercars, and again, not too dissimilar to how Test Drive Unlimited did it. The supercars take the place of the classic F1 cars which were last included in F1 2020, and they'll be integrated into the career mode in the same way the classic cars were, that being through occasional events which include checkpoint challenges and time trials, along with some new event types including, most bizarrely, drifting. F1 Life is the feature that concerns many and is being seen by some as validation to be concerned about EA's takeover of Codemasters and what that could mean for the F1 games. If you've seen any online discussion about the F1 games in the past year or so, then there's a good chance you will have seen a lot of concern about EA's impact on the F1 games, specifically on how aggressively they'll be monetized. It's a fear that stems from EA's reputation with other games, most notably Star Wars Battlefront 2, which received a colossal amount of backlash for its implementation of microtransactions and loot boxes. And the FIFA series has long had criticism levelled at it for the minimal changes to each year's release, and how heavily encouraged players are to spend real world money to be competitive in the game's Ultimate Team online game mode. There is a certain amount of trepidation from the F1 gaming community that F1 Life will follow in those footsteps. That said, there will inevitably be some form of monetization in F1 22 anyway, as the Podium Pass has been included in the F1 game since F1 2020, before EA's takeover of Codemasters, and that's got a purchasable VIP tier which gets you more customization options for your car and driver. Whether you'll be able to buy individual F1 Live clothing items or apartment furnishings with real world money isn't known yet, but it's worth remembering that F1 2019 had a similar system, albeit restricted only to racing gear and car liveries. There were over 100 separate items, all purchasable for £1 each. Again, that's a monetization strategy that predates EA's purchase of Codemasters. That's not to say there haven't been any changes since EA took control. Aside from the branding and marketing though, the only tangible effects so far have been the change in regional pricing, which meant the price for F1 2021 when brand new was much higher than it was when F1 2020 was new in many countries. A policy that's still in place for F1 22, and the very sudden and very recent delisting of older F1 games from digital game stores. Whether or not there will be any other unpopular changes and if F1 Life will prove to be the home for them is currently speculation, and so far there's been no sign of any significant gameplay elements requiring microtransactions. That said, it is an understandable concern given the direction EA and Codemasters have independently moved in the past few years. Also, there isn't any sign of an Ultimate Team mode coming to F1 22, although it is a game mode that's in the FIFA, Madden, and NHL games, which are all made by EA. It is worth remembering that EA does have past experience with producing Formula 1 games. That license ran from 1999 to 2002 and ended with a game spanning all 4 of those seasons. The PC version of that game, called F1 Challenge 99-02, is still highly revered for many reasons, including its realistic car handling, damage model, and, coincidentally or not, TV broadcast style presentation. EA's F1 game history is as varied as it is meaningless though, since F1 Challenge 99-02 was developed by Image Space Incorporated, who went on to develop both rFactor titles and nowadays are known as Studio 397. The console versions of EA's F1 games were handled by other development teams, and while some of those games were well reviewed at the time, none of them have aged all that well in the past 20 or so years. Although F1 Career Challenge was ahead of its time in some regards, as it was the first F1 game to have some sort of a career mode, and also no game since has had one that has spanned more than 2 F1 seasons. That game also had a primitive form of car upgrades integrated into career mode. Interactive pit stops, strict yellow flag rules, and a challenge mode are all other commendable qualities of EA's earlier F1 games. One of the other F1 games EA published was F1 Manager, which is still the most recently released officially licensed Formula 1 management game until Frontier's F1 Manager 22 comes out later in the year. Of course, there wasn't the possibility to add microtransactions into games back then, which makes any comparison with the older games not overly relevant. However, we will soon find out if F1 22, the first F1 game EA has had a hand in from start to finish for nearly 20 years, lives up to all the hype that the company has built up for it.